very good product placement from Richard Morgan behind it. I just
yes. Well, you know, we're not exactly a consumer brand, but it helps to have a kind of bit of, what's the word, recognition around, I suppose.
What's the time?
And seeing as I'm in the office, it may be the last day that will happen for a while.
Well, maybe you could have a.
Good afternoon to you all and welcome to this 110 Synergia Hybrid Forum. Let me thank all the speakers and partners namely the UK-India Business Council represented by Vice Chairman Richard McCallum, and Anglo-American, whose support has made this roundtable possible. Thank you very much, Richard and Richard. The topic for today's discussion is transitioning to a circular economy. We have 8 eminent speakers, and the endeavor, it has been the endeavor of the Synergia Foundation to bring some of the finest experts in the world on topics that we convene and provide insights we believe are bespoke to key stakeholders in government, industry, and civil society. Today, we have with us Professor Steve Evans, Director of Manufacturing from Cambridge University, Richard Heald, OBE, Chairman of the UK IBC and former Managing Director of NM Rothschild, Shyam Saran, former Foreign Secretary of India, Richard Morgan, Director and Head of Public Affairs, Anglo-American, Nitin Prasad, Chairman of Shell India, Kishore Jayaraman, President of Rolls-Royce India, Ranjan Mathai, former Foreign Secretary of India, and Rajiv Kushu, Chairman of IESA and Director of Corporate Affairs, Texas Instruments. The format will be as follows. We will request each of the openings of the speakers to make an opening remark for 6 to 8 minutes, and then we will follow up with some questions with the moderator or otherwise. We also have Srinivas Dwarakanath, the former CEO of Airbus, with us. Given their illustrious backgrounds and knowledge, and to ensure that we are using the time most productively, let me first invite Steve Evans, the Director of Cambridge. Steve is the Director of Research of Institute of Manufacturing at the University of Cambridge, and also the Director of EPSRC, Center for Innovative Manufacturing in Industrial Sustainability. His research seeks a deep understanding on how industry brings environment and social sustainability together in the areas of design and manufacturing practice. Over to you, Steve.
Good afternoon, and even good morning for those of us who are communicating from the UK. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you on this incredibly important topic. Some of us have been studying how industry might become more sustainable for many decades, and we work with companies and organizations around the world. So I don't have a lab. I'm not trying to invent a new technology to solve the problem. We ask research questions like what works and what doesn't work in the short term and the long term. And I'm going to try and answer those questions as related to the circular economy. So let's try and get some simple facts out there. The relationship between circular economy and the climate emergency, both CE. If we increase the amount of material that we maintain in the economy, the circular economy, that means that we dig up and grow less raw material, but importantly, we process those virgin materials, those ores, less. And that's where the big savings come from. The savings don't come from the factories that are circular. They come from the fact that those factories are taking in materials that are at the end of their first life rather than virgin materials. And the energy intensity of those is anything from 1/3 to 10% of the original materials. When we eventually reach a full circular economy, that means that we're going to have very significant savings in terms of CO2. And at the moment, the UK government prediction, with an industrial economy that's only 10% of the whole economy, is that we will achieve a 10% reduction in industrial CO2 emissions through a transition to the circular economy. So it's a significant benefit. It's not necessarily the main reason why people are doing it, but we are now seeing the very strong connection between circular economy and the climate emergency. I'd also like to put to sleep the argument that the circular economy is expensive. It's more expensive not to do it. In the long term, the circular economy changes the cost pie of manufacturing. So it reduces material costs, but it increases typically labor cost. But we also know that it can and should increase profit, both in the short term and the long term. There are some challenges to that though. No company, and there are some large companies in the room, even the large companies cannot implement a circular economy. The reason it's called a circular economy is that it has to operate at the level of the whole economy. So if one organization decides to take preemptive action, but the supply chain around it doesn't, then that could be a challenge for that organization. It will be a challenge because it needs the material supply sector, it needs the waste sector to change alongside it. And that simultaneous action is at the heart of why there is a policy question to be answered here, and not just a simple, if this is so economically sensible, why are not companies doing it today? It's because no one company can do the circular economy. Now, I'd like to give an example. I'm here with this lovely picture behind me in the Royal College of Art in the Material Futures Research Group. And we work on a very large project between Cambridge and the Royal College of Art and others on the fashion industry and moving the fashion industry to a circular system. And in some of the work that we've already done, we've demonstrated that the brands can reduce the price of availability of fast fashion. So the typical fast fashion consumer in Britain spends £50 every week on fast fashion. They buy one marquee item and use it once only in its entire life. Interestingly, on average, they have about £3,500 of credit card debt. So it's a challenge. We think we can halve that price by allowing them to take as many items as they want from their wardrobe back to the shop and replace it one for one with an item in the shop. So they would be allowed to have, say, 20 items at home, but notionally they have a wardrobe of thousands of items in the high street. That's one of the ways in which we can deliver the circular economy. We can double the profit for the brands while halving the price for the consumer and halving the environmental impact. But the brands in the high street alone cannot implement that system, and that goes to the implementation problem that I was talking about earlier. So let me talk briefly. If money isn't the problem, and if climate is a benefit, why aren't we doing it? And I've explained that cooperative action is one of the challenges. No single company can do it. So there needs to be policy and cooperative industrial effort. From our research, it's very clear that the way to learn about circular economy is firstly to learn about resource efficiency. So reducing the amount of material that it takes to make your current products with your current technologies. That will put money in your pocket, but will also give you the knowledge needed to go to the next stage, which is to make your current products, but with new input materials, whether they be end-of-life products that are coming back via a waste-based supply chain into your factories, or maybe with utterly new materials. So part of the work we're doing in this building here, the Royal College of Art, is replacing clothing materials with biologically based materials, but they come from farm waste. So you can take rice straw and turn it into clothing fibers. And I'm going to suggest that in the next 30 years, things like that will become more normal, and that will be the emerging of a circular economy. Our research tells us that the first 20% of the benefits of the circular economy are available for free. That if we do these resource efficiency things, we improve our learning and we get immediate cash benefits. But it does get difficult after that. And that's where cooperation and government policy become really important, because governments have to help industry de-risk the experiments, the circular experiments at scale. We need significant knowledge improvement. We need to understand the materials we use, in a deeper way in order to replace them with other materials. And that competence is part of a policy package that might help industry move to a circular economy. That's enough. I can talk forever. I am a teacher and I should stop.
Thank you, Steve. There is something of interest that when we spoke, you mentioned about your visit to Italy and to one of the top fashion designers. I thought it was an amazing insight, and would you care to share that?
So I can show you multi-layer spreadsheets which are developed to the standards that those businesses operate. So these are not very quick calculations made by academics at a distance with very positive biases to try and deliver a positive outcome. These are the very deep spreadsheets that say, if the circular economy took this direction, if we could sell to consumers this new idea of they hold a small amount of material at home, but they can swap that at a price for all of the material and clothing that's available in the high street. So we do know very clearly, we've worked out all of the things on logistics, on cleaning, on failure rate. We have something called the Yuck Theory. People have a theory that says nobody will wear an item of clothing that has been worn by somebody else. Well, they haven't bought much online recently in that case, because somebody has probably bought that, tried it on and sent it back. It actually is not a problem. And we ran, I think it was 1,700 participants, 1,709 in our experiment. Only one person complained that they thought the clothing had been stained by somebody previously. And because of the data that we had, we knew that that one was fresh out of the box, that it was a manufacturing stain, not a stain from a previous user. So, that when you run these experiments, you learn about what works and what doesn't work. And I would encourage some very serious experimentation.
Thank you very much, Steve. Let me now invite Richard Morgan from Anglo-American. Richard is the head of government relations for Anglo-American since 2010, and is basically, his expertise has been covering global political and sustainable issues, focusing on countries where Anglo-American has their operations. Over to you, Richard.
Thanks, and like Steve, I don't need to take my full allotment of time because I'm really here to learn and to listen. We are, as you probably know, as Anglo-American, one of the big materials producers or raw materials producers. And the sort of minerals that are relevant to the debate are probably, well, we do a range, but the ones that are in the question, the conversation a lot is iron ore and metallurgical coal going in to make steel, and then at the sort of more future-facing end, platinum, group metals, of which we're the world's biggest producer, and copper. And I completely take Steve's point about the most efficient thing to do would be for us to produce less, actually. I mean, as long as it could be recycled from somewhere else. All current analysis is that even if you recycled more, you still wouldn't obviate the need for fresh virgin materials, if you like, from platinum group metals or for copper. So there will still be a place for mining, traditional mining activity, but it would be remiss of us as kind of future planners not to have this conversation, especially with big client countries like India, as to where the thinking is going, because as Steve says, no one company is going to influence this, particularly it's the policy framework that we're looking towards and indeed helping to contribute to. From the reality of business as it stands perspective, as Steve also set out, the there isn't a particular advantage for us, if you like, to go into recycling. It would have to be a big commitment of faith for us to do it. Recycling metals is not attractive to a big mining company, particularly. The barriers to entry are pretty low, and it doesn't have a great reputation as an industry. So it's not something that we would automatically just do as part of our business development. However, if the policy environment were to change and we were to be part of a conversation where that was changing, then we are of course immediately more interested. We're interested from a values point of view, and a lot of our, exactly again, as Steve said, a lot of what we're concentrating on at the moment is reducing the associated resource that goes into producing the materials that we do. So for example, take platinum, it's very unconcentrated in the ground at 0.01% or something. You've got a lot of refining and smelting to do at large energy input to turn it into platinum and all the other group metals that come out of that. So there are ways you can make that more efficient. And clearly the move in the climate related policy world towards scope 3 means that we have to concentrate even harder on that, because we're going to be measured across the whole value chain of our product, so that no longer is it just a question of us putting it on a ship and that's the end of our responsibility. I think we're thinking, and we obviously majority owners of the De Beers Group, they have been thinking of that process on diamonds from mine to finger for quite a long time, and that's a whole range of inputs to ensure that you have an ethical end product that you can market as an ethical end product. And I think we're seeing that coming through a lot now with responsible steel, responsible copper, and both investors and traders in the shape of the London Metals Exchange requiring that sense of full value chain, so that when we sell into, say, Asia or Europe, we will be looking as the producer of those materials to look at what our clients want in a much more holistic way, or the consumers beyond that want. And so therefore conversations with some of the car producers into how you can, and obviously there's a lot of focus on Tesla and getting its cobalt from the DRC. As is currently the case, we feel we aren't able to operate in the DRC, but if that's where a lot of future others who want to make that journey as well. So I think that's where we're at. And we're anticipating clearly that the industrial material, the industrialization materials will still be relevant to countries like India. So steel will be with us for a very considerable future. But the things like copper obviously have got a big uptick coming along with all the demand for electrification. So we're very alive to this debate, and I'm really interested to hear what others have got to say. So I think I'll stop there, Toby. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard, for those insights. In the interest of time, I'll just leave all the questions to the end. But let me now invite Kishore Jayaraman, the president of Rolls-Royce India, to share India and South Asia, to share his insights about the defense and the sort of engineering industry. Kishore, are you there? Yeah.
No, tell him that it's on mute.
I think there is a connection issue with Kishore. We'll get back to Kishore later. May I invite Richard Heald, OBE, to now share his thoughts. He was is the chairman of the UK IBC now, and also earlier the managing director of Rothschild, India, for many years. So Richard, would you be kind to share your thoughts?
Thank you very much. I have to say I approach this subject with some degree of trepidation on the basis that the panelists are infinitely more knowledgeable on this subject than I am. And so the approach I'm going to take is to ask some questions and to speculate on how we might move forward. UKIBC has recently put quite a degree of focus onto looking at the commitments that UK businesses in India have been making through the prism of SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, ESG, etc. And I've been in India for the past 3.5 weeks, came back last week, but I started my journey by sitting with Amitabh Kant in front of an audience to talk about the impact that UK businesses are having in this area. And to a certain extent, the circular economy and what we're talking about here has a relevance, extreme relevance to this. I look at the debate around the circular economy and what we've heard from Richard and from Steve, and I kind of, to a certain extent, find myself wondering how practical and how quickly the goals, if you like, of the circular economy can be rolled out, and whether indeed there are differences that relate to the rollout as between a developing economy and a developed economy that we have in the UK. We're aware that there was some degree of ruckus in COP26 around the announcement between phase out and phasing down in relation to coal. And I feel to a certain extent that we would have the same debate in terms of the introduction of a circular economy in a developing nation as we've had in relation to coal. Now, that's not to say that India is not committed to reducing its dependency on coal, or indeed introducing more circularity into its economy. It's merely how practical is it to do it, and on what time frame. Having addressed that point, if you like, I also speculate in my own mind as to whether actually India is further advanced in terms of thinking around circular economy, particularly bearing in mind that 60% of the population is engaged in the agricultural sector. And, you know, if there is one element that I believe should have an empathy towards the objectives of a circular economy, it has to be the agricultural sector. That having been said, I believe that there is a role that can be played by external factors, certainly the government. We've seen that Niti Aayog has been extremely effective in galvanizing the states in terms of behavior by introducing elements around competitive federalism, ease of doing business, etc. And it seems to me that the government, through Niti Aayog and through these mechanisms, has a way of, if you like, driving behavior in a most efficient method. That having been said, you know, there is this theory that for everything that is made, you're never going to actually be able to completely avoid the impact of it as it travels through its lifetime. I mean, I spent a period of time traveling around India, looking at, since I hadn't been there since February 2020, looking at the developments that have occurred. And one of the most interesting visits I had was I visited the new EV factory that is being built by Ola between Bangalore and Chennai. And there you have a factory that is going to, when completed, be something in the region of 2 million square feet. It will produce 10 million units a year, which is something like 15% of the entire global current production of two-wheelers. So it's a very large facility. However, all of those two-wheelers are going to be powered by battery technology, which is finite. And after 8 years, despite the positive impact that is going to be had through the use of EV, you are going to have, by definition, you're going to have a vast number of batteries that will become defunct, which will have to be recycled in some form or another. And how does that fit within the circularity that we're trying to achieve? At the same time, there is a huge debate, a positive debate in India around the introduction of hydrogen fuel technology. Now, we know that you either have grey, blue or green hydrogen, but if you focus on blue hydrogen, which is essentially all around carbon capture, there you have the disposal in a secure form of the carbon waste. And therefore what you're doing is effectively you're separating out the more hazardous elements from the harmful elements, but you're burying them in the ground. How does that fit within the circular economy that is all our aspirations? So I think there are questions here to be asked, and I know that this is the start of a process, so I'm throwing out these questions. My final point is that what I've seen from the analysis that we've been doing on SDGs, on ESGs, and also to a certain extent listening to Richard and Steve, is that I think the financial services sector has a lot to play in this, insofar as we are increasingly seeing investors, shareholders in public companies becoming more and more demanding of boards and of companies in relation to strategies that actually play to the SDG goals and or to the circular economy. Increasingly, investors are wanting to invest in these companies, not purely for commercial reasons, but also for other reasons as well. And I think that pressure, as it continues, will also encourage us to look at ways in which we might be able to develop the circular economy in a more accelerated and productive way. Those are theories and thoughts that I put out there, and I'm very aware that I'm sitting in front of an academic from Cambridge, who I can tell you I went to Oxford and I hated my tutorials. So I'm going to close off at that point in time and leave the questions to be answered by those who are more knowledgeable than I am. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Steve, I would like to get back to you. You have heard three industry experts make their comment. Would you like to add something as an intervention or an observation?
So let me first of all reassure Richard Morgan. I think that in the long term, according to our calculations, we need to continue to mine about 50% of what we mine today. We'll mine that using different processes. Because in the very long term, and this is also a partial answer to Richard Heald's comments, in the very long term, we will have a surplus of electricity. Now, in the medium term, it's a real problem. The circular economy demands energy to recycle things. The availability of that energy can be a challenge. But in the very long term, imagine a world where we have a lot of intermittent energy supply and intermittent energy demand. There will be moments where electrons are effectively near free or even negative cost. So we will build new industries and shape industries because of that. I think we'll be digging out of the ground about half of what we're currently digging. So well done, Richard, you've still got a job and a pension. But that also means that many of the problems that you potentially describe, Richard Heald, will go away in the very long term. The really hard question, which is part of the exam question today, and it's not a tutorial, you will not be marked. The very hard question is, how do we transition? You know, we often hear this metaphor, how do you cross a chasm in 2 leaps? You might have a very sensible linear economic system, and you might even have an economically sensible circular economy in the future. But what's the midpoint? How do we get through that? I do think that there are solutions to this. Richard, I would like to take you up on your COP26 ruckus point. I think that, you know, I'm rather disappointed is a very calm phrase for how I feel. I think that the lack of trust between the developing and developed economies became focused on one word. And actually, that lack of trust has been building for some time. And you know, promises were made as far back as 2006 about how the developed economies would help the developing economies, without saying we're going to constrain your opportunity to give your people the quality of life that our people currently take for granted. And that, to me, was the essence of the failure of COP26. And it all got worked up into a word that's related to coal, and it's actually related to trust, and the relationship between the developed and the developing economies, I think, is the core problem that was failed. The developing economies failed, the developed economies failed the developing economies at COP26, and we are seeing the consequences, and I'm very personally sad about that. I'm very happy to hear Richard Morgan talk about, you know, it's potentially a commitment of faith to go into recycling, and you know, it's that point about, is the midpoint unprofitable? If policymakers can help bring long-term clarity to understand that that midpoint is going to be fairly temporary with the right type of support, and we will eventually get to the other side of the chasm, then we may indeed see organizations make that commitment of faith. And I think your comment, undoubtedly Anglo-American in 50 years' time will be a material stewardship company. You will use your knowledge to keep the maximum value attained to every molecule of steel. And that will become normal. How we get there, again, we're going to have the chasm metaphor. So I hope that the speakers afterwards are going to be really helpful and explain how we jump the chasm without falling down.
Thank you so much, Steve, for sharing those very profound insights. Can I now invite Kishore Jayaraman, the president of Rolls-Royce India and South Asia, to share his thoughts.
Well, first of all, apologies. I missed out a little bit before. I just had some challenges with my IT. And so anyways, it looks like it's fixed. If you guys can hear me well, and if you can see me, I guess that should be behind us. Thank you very much, Toby, for inviting me. Thanks to UK IBC and Anglo-American for having me here to share some thoughts about the circular economy and what it means for Rolls-Royce. You know, from a industrial system point of view, I think it is very important for us to figure out how to reduce waste, to reuse stuff that we do, and to recycle things that we can recycle. But before we get to that very generic thought process, we figured a couple of things are very important for us as we look into the future. The world is going to be for us about digital. The world is going to be about electrical. And the reason why electrical is because Rolls-Royce has signed up to the net zero campaign by the UN to have products and services and solutions that will be net zero by 2050. And we have also made a commitment saying that by 2030, all our facilities around the world will be net zero. But now 2030 is only about 8 years away from where we are. And so it means immediately we need to figure out what are the things we need to look at and how do we look at stuff and what do we have to do with things. Before, it used to be where we needed to have prototypes, we needed to have testing rigs, we needed to have a lot of things going for us. We do have the same today. But as we look into the future, we want to be able to use our data. We have lots and lots of data that we collect during every process. And we want to be able to use digital first in everything that we do inside the company to eliminate any waste, and also make sure that we are able to create digital twins. So a lot of things that we need to have a physical prototype, we should be able to do it with a digital prototype. And with that, we'll be able to optimize manufacturing processes, production processes, and we should be able to get towards designs that will go towards the final goal as quickly as possible. This not only reduces time of bringing design into a production facility, but it also optimizes the way we do things. And instead of taking years to optimize, it'll take us probably months to optimize. But when we look at digital, it's going to become an intertwined part of electrical. We learn from the data, what we've collected with all the fossil fuel generation turbines that we have today, that we have produced over the last 100 years, and learn from them. And as we create our electrical systems, we want to make sure that all these learnings go in and we're able to create our products sustainably into the future. In that direction, we have already created our first electrical aircraft. As you must have heard, it actually broke a speed record a month back. And I think we continue to push the envelope, and our goal is to probably have it fly 100 miles and on a single fuel charge. And then following that, what we would like to do is probably look at eVTOLs, which is electric vertical takeoff and landing, which is a helicopter, but it's all electrical. And with this, mobility goes to a different state. There are many, many companies that are willing to be the end users as well as operators, and there are companies that will do all the different kind of, different components that is required in order to build this. And it's not just Rolls-Royce. We have one company that makes the engines. There are many companies that are also in that direction. Now, as we go towards this journey, what is also extremely important for us is to realize that we cannot just get there. And I think Steve's point about, jumping the chasm is very interesting, because we cannot jump a chasm in 2 leaps, and we probably have to build a plank, a road, and slowly cross it. But regardless, for us, we are looking at it and saying, how do we cross it? Let's take it step by step. So today we are into sustainable fuels. And with sustainable fuels, what we are able to do is we are able to take it to the next level of where we toss in fossil fuels, and we are able to reduce the emissions. And then as we go further, we will start moving in the direction of complete electrical systems. Now, having said all this, I think it's all not going to work unless the world at large changes and unless everybody is demanding for it. And interestingly, for the very first time when I flew from the United States to India a couple of months back, I noticed that in the aircraft, the pilot made an interesting sort of note. Usually they don't talk about how much emissions reductions has happened during that flight. And interestingly, on that flight, they said that we'll be reducing the emissions by 20% on this particular flight due to various reasons. And interestingly, and I'm not saying it for the session, but it was very nice for me to note that it was flying on Rolls-Royce wheels. It was an XWB engine that it was flying on. And then when I heard this, I said, look, the world is realizing how important it is. And I think they are moving in that direction where they would like to see emissions reductions, where people would like to see Earth being more sustainable. And it was very, very nice feeling for me. So I'll stop right there. But digital and electrical it is for us. And net zero, we mean it. We want to be there. The journey is started.
Thank you, Kishore. Let me invite Ranjan Mathai. Ranjan was the former Foreign Secretary of India, besides being ambassador to UK and several other countries. But one of the areas where Ranjan has contributed actively to the Synergia Foundation is in the area of energy and sustainability. So Ranjan, why don't you come in and probably ask questions to either Steve or the other panelists and make your own observation.
Thank you, Toby. I'm relieved that you're assigning me only questions because I wasn't intended as a panelist. I think this is incredibly important, but like most of the chasms or little ditches that humanity has crossed over history, I think usually the experience has been muddling through in some way or the other and finding your way out to the next. I don't think there has been any era in history where we've been able to go over in one leap. I have 2-3 questions. I was really very happy to hear about Steve's point about the energy intensity and the outcome of recycling of metals being so positive. In our own experience, we are a nation of recyclers from everything from paper to et cetera, et cetera. The aluminum produced from recycling does not have the same properties as aluminium produced from bauxite. I think that is the case also with copper, but I could be corrected, and that could be very dangerous for the electrical industry. I think we are learning for the first time, very first time in the last 1 or 2 months, the actual experience of China in producing the rare earths on which so much of this high-valued technology of the brave new world we are entering is dependent. They are acknowledging the extraordinary energy intensity, the extraordinary pollution. All this came up because their supplies from Myanmar suddenly stopped, and everyone said, hey, what has Myanmar got to do with Chinese rare earth? And then we discovered the masses of transportation of raw materials which go in and then are finally produced as rare earths, at least for 2 out of the 6 or 7 heavy rare earths where China is so dominant. So I think this is, there are a lot of questions. The question, I have 2 other questions, and one is that if we live in a world where everyone is quite happy to go and exchange a high fashion product, that's fine, but it seems to me there is a lot of effort being made into tracking and tracing products in the sense that through their life cycle. Will that take away from the privacy of individuals who buy a product and don't want to be tracked for having had that in their equipment or in their product all their lives? And finally, at the international trade level, just as we know with the COP26, you rightly pointed out the suspicions that grew. There was once early in the recycling, circular economy debate, an argument that the developing world should not stand in the way of wastes being sent where they could be more efficiently handled, which is the developing countries of the world. And we are now seeing with the carbon taxes, border taxes of the EU, we do not want to get into a world where circularity becomes another impediment to global trade. I'll leave it there and just throwing it open for discussion.
Yeah, I think we will come back to that if it's okay a little after we hear from Rajiv Kushu. Rajiv is the chairman of the Semiconductor and Electronic Industry Association of India and director for corporate affairs for Texas Instruments. We thought it would be a good idea to get a perspective from the semiconductor and electronic industry. Rajiv, I hope you can join us. Are you there, Rajiv? He's there. Let me take this question on to Srinivas Dwarakanath, who was until recently the CEO of Airbus Industries, and I think he would be able to provide us a great insight.
Hey, thanks. Sorry, I think I got disconnected. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, Rajiv, continue. Yeah.
Sorry. I think a couple of things I just wanted to talk about. I think it's very important from India perspective, where there's so much of focus on electronics. We are seeing a lot of initiatives from the government to have the semiconductor fab in the country, and apart from that, there's a lot of initiatives for getting ESDM manufacturing into the country. So for a country like India, where we are producing now close to 250 million to 300 million smartphones, and it may at some point of time, and we have seen it in areas around Delhi and NCR, the heaps of electronic waste getting dumped in the dump. So there's a huge opportunity for the country to see how we can reuse it. I think there was a interesting observation where I found out that if you see 1 million smartphones, and 1 million smartphones actually, if you are able to, you can actually extract close to 15 kgs of palladium, 34 kgs of gold, 350 kgs of silver, and 16,000 kgs of copper. So what I'm trying to say is that this is, since this industry is exploding in the country, I think the right policies have to be pushed with the government, and as IEC we are working with the government in different areas, and this is one of the areas where we will be working with Ministry of Electronics and Information, through Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, to kind of help this industry so that we are able to sustainably produce and consume electronic products in the country. I think this is what I would like to stop here and hear the comments from the people, and I would like to come back if there are any questions on that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rajiv, for those insights about the sort of material that can be extracted out of the electronic mobile phones. Sri Dwaraka, would you like to join in?
Hi, Toby. Thank you very much, for giving me the opportunity. And I was not part of the original panel. I hope you can hear me well, Toby.
We can.
All right. Okay. So I just wanted to probably highlight, as Kishore was talking about the industry perspective from Rolls-Royce, and similarly at Airbus, even though I'm not part of it, there has been a strong sustainability goal, right? So I think Airbus has really, looked at more from the CO2 emissions point of view. There's been a big push to start with improving the aircraft in terms of, the CO2 emissions, and then the sustainability, sustainable aviation fuel is the next step along that journey. And then moving towards hybrid, conventional fuel plus electric, moving towards hydrogen, as a fuel. So Airbus has actually taken a bet on hydrogen and then investigating that to have a demonstrable aircraft by 2035. So the focus has been predominantly on the CO2 emissions. But having said that, there has also been a big push on the aircraft itself, apart from the emissions in terms of the material which is being used in the aircraft, and how do we dismantle the aircraft and how do we recycle. It's been interesting that I've been mentoring one of the startups which takes many of the parts of the aircraft in terms of whether it's a fuselage or other areas, and then make furnitures out of it. And it's very interesting. And on the other hand, also there have been some of them, promoting the idea of setting up restaurants using fuselage sections, for example. So, those types of things. So really, the idea of recycling the whole thing, is catching up, but it needs still a long way to go. But in terms of a question, as Professor Evans was mentioning earlier, I have probably a question for him in the sense that what do we think would be probably a policy which the government could initiate or collectively could initiate as a next step? Would it make sense to for the governments to on an extreme to ban materials that cannot be recycled easily? Or, can they sort of come up and say 20% of the materials which companies have to use should be reusable ones, or at least they use the reusable material as an intake? Or in what form can such a policy take? Because it needs to be a combination of a few things, right? Individually the companies need to take the initiatives, but also there needs to be a government policy come incentive which need to be provided as well for us to go towards that. That's we can see that happening on the CO2 emissions. So it'll be interesting to hear his thoughts on that as well. So with that, back to you, Toby.
Thank you, Dwaraka. Excellent insights again. Can I now invite Nitin Prasad, the chairman of Shell, to come and share his thoughts.
Yeah, thank you very much, and good afternoon to everybody, or good day to everybody across the world. Toby, I think it's a fascinating topic, and it's been really great to hear all the different perspectives that are there. In the world of energy, I think there's no doubt that there must be a fundamental change in how energy is produced and consumed. And there is a lot of work that needs to go in terms of infrastructure investment and driving a net zero, whether it's by 2070 for India, which I think is a conservative commitment, is the way I would look at it. But the reality is most of us as corporates in India, we have to take a look at it more of an ambitious 2050 timeline, in line with the expectations of society and other sort of stakeholders that are there. But let's take a look at some of the aspects of the circular economy for us. Certainly, one of the things that we should really begin with is just sort of appreciating that energy efficiency and material efficiency is an incredibly important part of low carbon choices and in an energy system-wide transition. And frankly, it's quite intrinsic to the circular economy development itself. And there's plenty of examples, I think, where we are not as efficient as we can be. Now, Indian industry, for a wide variety of reasons, but largely driven by the economic incentives that have been given over the last decades, actually on an energy efficiency basis is quite efficient in terms of what it produces. However, material efficiency, I think, is where we significantly sort of lag behind. We were doing some work on waste characterization in municipal waste locations and in Delhi, and the data that came out suggested that 50% of the waste in Delhi, which is about 8,000 tons per day, is actually inert material. It's like construction material, concrete and other sort of bricks and other sort of sources that have not been effectively utilized. So there is a lot to be done in just us being much more conscious about the material efficiency side as well as the energy efficiency side. Now, but just speaking on the topic of waste as we go forward, we do recognize that by 2050, half the world's population, India's population, will live in cities. And if you give an estimate, the municipal solid waste could increase to about 400 million tons a year. And that's the amount of waste that we're going to come back and generate. Now, this is considerably more than the 62 million tons that our cities are generating in 2016. And the reality is that about 70% of that waste is collected and disposed of in open landfills without proper treatment or containment. But that in itself represents an opportunity because if you do take a look at the waste, and I characterize that just for Delhi about 50% being inert, but actually there's about 50% that can be processed. There is the technology for us to think about whether it's landfill mining or for example, even collection at source and reprocessing the waste. It is possible for us to come and take those technologies forward. We can even start to take a look at technologies that do plastics pyrolysis and recycle and conversion of a pyrolysis oil back into the chemicals, the chain, to effectively be reprocessed again as we go forward. And so there is the emergence of our technological solutions to think about how we can actually take what is a growing municipal waste challenge, an industrial waste challenge, to actually and develop the solutions to take that forward. The same, of course, applies for agricultural waste. Now today, agricultural waste is effectively burnt, and it has the consequences of the air pollution issues that we all suffer from in northern India, towards the end of the year. But there is, again, the ability for us to think about, extraction. There's been some great work that was done by CII that went and demonstrated across 300 villages the ability to economically extract the stubble, to reprocess that into briquettes, and to then offer that for sale. So, generating an additional source of income for the farmers, to, industries such as cement or for that matter, in other bioprocessing industries, to come back and used. And so you can see the emergence of a really interesting, value chain in that particular structure. I think some of the other interesting things that are quite exciting is how does a natural bioeconomy actually start to come back and emerge. We all recognize that there is absolute applicability of natural solutions, and the reality is we keep saying net, 2050, net 2060, net 2070, but I think more often than not we actually lose sight of the word net. And this is quite important because its net is not zero. It's not absolute zero. It means that there is a plus and there is a minus. And we need the minus because if you take a look at the industrial activity, we cannot get to an absolute zero in our industrial activity. We have done, for example, we did a scenario, you can see the cover behind me, for what a 2050 net zero for India could possibly look like. And it suggests that today India does industrial emissions about 1.3 gigatons. But India in a 2050 scenario must triple the amount of industrial activity that it needs to actually shift the economic activity and move the development needle as it aspires to do. But in tripling the amount of industrial emissions, the actual industrial activity, the industrial emissions actually stagnates to about 1.2 to 1.3 gigatons per year. But that's still not zero. We've actually worked very closely with cement and steel industry. And the thing is that by the time you do the carbon accounting and you identify all the possible sources of emissions, well, some of them are in parts of the units where we frankly just cannot simply capture them, or we cannot transition them to alternatives. So we need to kind of think about that there will be residual emissions, that there need to be emissions. Why is this important? Because this comes back and suggests that we need to think about a circular solution in the bioeconomy and see what that starts to come back and generate for us, whether it is taking natural solutions and then effectively on arable land and then reprocessing them into fuel-based solutions or other sort of combinations of technologies. We at Shell are pretty much committed to this particular space, and we do have the technology and the capability and that we have been exploring across a range of different things, whether it's biodiesel or using used cooking oil or generating bioethanol or sustainable aviation fuel, a number of different things that we're producing. In fact, some really interesting technology in Bangalore that we've developed that can take it in municipal solid waste and convert that into equivalent transportation fuels, with the byproduct being biochar, which we can actually put back in for fertilizer utilization. So something that could achieve greater than 90% GHG reduction, but actually if you then come back and generate the feed source from agricultural waste versus its alternative, or even generate create the agricultural products, whether from bamboo feed or something else on arable land, then you're actually talking about a net negative technology. And it's these combinations of technologies that can lead to a full sort of circular type solution. A lot's been come back and said about, what do we need to come and do and what do we need to watch out for? So let me just talk about a little bit of what do we need to watch out for and then what do we need to kind of come back and do. Why is some of this stuff, we can talk, this all sounds wonderful, we have all the answers, right? There's problems. And what are some of the problems? The first problem is that many of these things have unintended consequences. And we have to be really careful about some of these unintended consequences. I'll give you a case in point. As we started to take a look at very closely in terms of what we can come back and do in terms of, landfill extraction of plastics, what of course happened was that it potentially can aggravate what is the waste picker situation, and which is actually women and children picking plastics in waste. I've been to Dharavi slums and I encourage people to come and take a look at it. It's a fascinating sort of cycle that comes back and exists. And if we're not careful about creating significant economic demand drivers of some of these products, the unintended consequence will be that we will actually encourage more of that. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it. It just simply means that we have to be very, very choiceful and purposeful about how we do it and how do we take that forward. And you see that also come through in some of the points in terms of the electronic waste and the processing of electronic waste. How do we sort of take some of those things forward? The next thing that comes through very clearly is vested interests. Suffice it to say that actually India is a quite efficient and circular economy, and it has probably to do with our genesis of being a largely a closed economy for many, many decades. Who doesn't remember our stories of parents and grandparents and so forth who have managed to keep cars running for the better part of 25, 30 years? I remember my grandfather drove his Fiat for about 25 years. That thing had been rebuilt 3 times over. And it was wonderful. I mean, the air conditioner, my father-in-law still talks about, he managed to get it running for 20 years and process it again and again and again and again. And that's I don't think I'm the exception. I think, this is what we have in our families. This is how we grew up. We have not been a consuming economy that simply wastes things. This is actually a fairly modern trend for us. in terms of what we're doing. And therefore, we have the genesis, we have within our legacy and our DNA the ability to sort of come back and do this. So, my point is that if we want to think about the alternatives of how we come back and use this, we should recognize that there are vested interests. Again, the case in point of the waste pickers and the plastics. As you take a look at the supply chain, well, there's waste pickers, they do pick plastics. Actually, the actual plastics available in landfills is actually quite low. That plastics is actually taken in the Bombay structure, there's about 8 different counters where there's a daily trading rate in terms of what is actually come back and set, and then it is reprocessed. Now, that is a existing supply chain structure that exists, and a fairly sophisticated one in terms of what things. And now that is something that we have to be conscious about, that this is not just simply things that are just simply lying around in our economy in terms of what we do. The larger point on this one is essentially that what has been a disorganized or an unorganized sector, which has been running in a particular fashion. We are in the process of trying to change that, into something that is much more professional in structure, and that is creating its own sort of tension points, and it creates a pace of change that is not natural. So we have our own behavioral challenges in terms of what we come back and do as individuals, households, consumers, or in industries and companies. But frankly, we also have challenges in changing the basic value chains as they exist today to be able to take some of that forward. And that is going to require us to really come back and think about how we do that. So what does it take? Well, with apologies for taking so much time. In my view, simple things like, policy indicators are absolutely essential. Policy and stability of policy, I can't emphasize this enough. I mean, we see far too much of volatility in policy statements and intentions, and almost sort of testing, where we want to go. As companies, if we want to come back and invest in significant infrastructure development to build the circular chains and to effectively change these value chains and to make the behavioral changes that we need to do, we need to see consistency and certainty in terms of how we come back and do that. Doesn't mean that we need incentives. We're not asking for handouts, but we need to see the stability in how we can go about doing it to take some of that forward. What we also need to see is the government to see its role change quite dramatically, because the role is not, here's my big check, or here's a tax, or here's the stick, or here's the carrot, or here's my policy, please go do it. But actually, what we need is facilitation. Facilitation that recognizes that our challenge is not the availability of technologies, it is the pace of commercialization of those technologies. To take, in our language, a TRL 345 and take it into a TRL 9, which traditionally has taken the better part of 30 years, we're trying to compress that down into a third of its time, which requires really strong facilitation from a government to come and bring all the relevant stakeholders together to come back and make sure that demand, supply, and financing, infrastructure all move lockstep together, so that there's no single part of the solution that is left behind. And the third piece I think is incredibly important is that we come back and recognize that it is entirely possible for us to rechange and become much more circular in our supply chains, in our structures, in our economies. But the thing is that without the demand drivers to come back and the acceptability of some of these solutions, we're going to find ourselves very quickly, becoming circular without necessarily getting the emphasis that we need to see to move that forward. Now, I don't think that's as much of a problem as it exists from some of the emission side of the house. But I do think that it is something that again needs to be well established in terms of what we do. Let me pause there. There's obviously a lot more that can be said in terms of enablers and challenges, but I thought that would be our perspective on some of this.
Thank you so much, Nitin, for a very extensive but thorough presentation. Let me get back to Steve very quickly. Steve, if you remember the questions that were flagged to you by Ranjan and any of the other panelists who would like to respond, be grateful if you could probably make your intervention.
Well, it does now feel like a supervision, Richard, and I've got a series of answers, so please bear with me and I'll go through one at a time. Firstly, as a nation, we're encouraging our industrial system and our consumers to buy gold from other nations, to send our money out of India and then to bury the gold in a landfill. I mean, it's nonsense. At the level of the biggest picture, we know that is not sustainable. So if we know it's not sustainable, what will the solution look like? And it's, there's a very competent group of people here who are really good at identifying the problems. And actually, that's the first step. It's not a negative statement on my part. If you understand the very specific problems that we have to overcome, then you have the possibility of designing solutions. And I'd like to offer some possibilities. Nitin rightly called for what we would call long, loud and clear policy. When you're making this type of transition, policies have to exist for long periods of time to match investment cycles. If we think that the government is going to change their mind on a carbon tax in 2 years' time, we simply don't know how to invest. And I want to give a couple of examples of good policy that does that. In the UK, we had an excellent policy on the landfill tax. Oh, by the way, I tend to dislike the politicians' desire to tax and regulate because actually they don't like doing either of those things. And it's seen as a last resort by all partners. What we need to do is use many of the other instruments of policymaking, and I wanted to offer some. In the UK, we did implement a tax on landfill, but we created an escalator. So we implemented the landfill tax, and in the first years, we collected £0 per tonne. And we just got used to the paperwork and the policing of the system. And then it went up to £8 per tonne, and 2 years later to 16, and 2 years later to 24. Eventually it starts to hurt, but that is something that you can plan for in the long term. You can look forward 15 years and understand what the tax level will be. I think that's a very interesting one. In Japan, they have the top runner scheme, which is a really interesting idea. If you look at something like air conditioning efficiency, every N years, N depending on the speed of the innovation cycle of that particular sector, the government looks at what is the best air conditioner that's out there and says in N years' time from today, that will become the minimum standard. So the standard is set by industry. If it's physically available, that's going to be a minimum in 5 years' time. And I think there's a really interesting dynamic and relationship between industry and government in that particular form of legislation. But my request in the circular economy arena is government needs to help us conduct experiments at scale, not lab-based or one-off small projects. You know, your example of briquettes, which I'll come to in a minute, is very good. But at the level of hundreds of villages, that's still, to me, too small to demonstrate industrialization. On that point, I'd like to grab the agri-waste point and maybe offer some opportunity, hope for the future. So we do a lot of agri-waste. I'm here in the Royal College of Art because we're taking a biological approach to dealing with agri-waste, as opposed to a classic sort of downcycling, which says we'll take a raw material and we'll try and compound it into a brick. We'll take rice straw and compound it into a brick. But rice straw contains some really interesting molecules and some really interesting fibers. And what we're doing is looking, for example, we've been looking at wheat straw in the UK. There are some really interesting molecules in there, and those molecules retail at up to $36,000 a kilo because they're pharmaceuticals, or more accurately, nutraceuticals. And we're turning nutraceuticals into bricks. It's nearly as bad as throwing gold into a landfill. I can imagine a future, and we've been doing some projects with a company called Ecova, who make cleaning products, largely in Europe, and they make the cleaning products from plant-based origins rather than mineral-based, hence their name Ecova. And they wanted to put a factory up on the island of Mallorca. And they had this marvelous idea, and I want to leave this as a piece of hope and link it back to the digital challenge that was offered earlier. If you fly a satellite over the island and you combine the satellite data with weather data, you can predict that Farmer Richard is going to be producing 2,000 litres of orange juice next Thursday. But you can also predict that they will produce 2,000 kilos of orange pulp waste. You can also predict that the other farmer, who's also going to be called Richard, for the sake of today's call, will be producing olives, and you can predict their waste. Now, if you do this at the level of the whole island, you have what I call a Friday night fridge problem. You have a whole series of materials. You then process that data through the world database of 40 million possible chemical processes, and they will tell you how to take combinations of those wastes through a variety of processes to create end materials. You then make the enzymes necessary, you fly the enzymes a few kilos to the island, to the factory, you grab these materials from the farmers and you turn it into shampoo, or you turn it into toilet cleaner, depending on the material availability. To me, that's a future circular economy. It's highly intelligent, it's highly digital, and it's maximizing the value of every possible molecule that we can get hold of. And I'm going to try and leave that out there as a hope for the future.
Thank you again, Steve. Let me now invite, as we are coming closer to the sort of time that we have set, let me invite Richard McCallum, the Vice Chairman of UKIBC, to sort of tell us what we will be doing in future. Richard, would you like to come in?
Hi, Toby, can you hear me?
Yes.
Brilliant. Yeah, well, I think you wanted me to sum up and thank people. Thank you. It's been an absolutely fascinating hour or so. We've heard a huge amount of interesting content, ranging from platinums to digital first to Play Street fashion, and I'm not going to recap that, but clearly there's a huge amount to be sifted through and woven together to get a better understanding of what does transition look like, or how do we cross the chasm, as to use Steve's phrase. I was particularly struck that we're talking here about the whole economy, that individual industries or countries indeed can't do this in isolation without the supply chain around them coming along too, and there's a need for consultation with government to ensure the right non-volatile, long policy framework. I was also struck by how this immense challenge is an immense opportunity. In that context, where I think Richard, Toby and I want to get to is ultimately a report which distills the big questions and ideas about transition from this event, and from a second and possibly a third iteration of this forum, as we drill down further into the subject. And I think the idea, Toby, correct me if I'm wrong, is to launch that report leading up to or during the Synergia conclave in October next year. I'd like to extend thanks to the panelists, Mr. Matai, Richard, Nitin, Kishore, Steve, Rajiv, Srinivasan, and extend congratulations to Toby and Richard Morgan for conceptualizing this timely and important event. And thank you for inviting UKBC to be part of it. Toby, back to you.
Yeah, we are about 5:45, so about 10 minutes, 15 minutes more. Thank you everyone for taking part. As Richard mentioned, we will be convening version 2, version 3, just to do a little bit of more ideation, because this is just the start, and I hope all of you would support and be part of this journey of trying to better understand. And what we bring is this cross-disciplinary knowledge. So we look at different industries and try to see how we can sort of weave through them, and are there some practices that we can look at. Thank you very much, and have a lovely evening, or a lovely afternoon, Steve.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.